Hello, listeners of the Mad Scientist Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cogswell, here with my co-host, Marie Mayhew. Marie, how's it going?
Mad Scientist Podcast.
You know what's pretty exciting, actually, is as we're recording right now, the very first episode of our radio show goes out in 25 minutes on KRSM 98.9 here in the Twin Cities.
Oh my God.
Pretty amazing.
Oh my God. It's like we're a juggernaut.
We are a
juggernaut.
Like we're a juggernaut. It's like people have finally realized how juggernauty we are. It's amazing.
We are juggernauting.
I mean, we're doing great. So, because we are a podcast, we're going to do an episode on the Golden State Killer.
We have to.
But we're going to do it in a different way than everyone else is doing it, hopefully. Because because actually, in an interesting way, this concept of how they actually caught the killer, the way that they actually caught this suspect, it has a lot of questions for bioethics and the ethical use of science for military or governmental purposes. It really has a lot of tie-in to kind of the topic that we've been talking about already, the military-industrial complex. So, for those that don't know, the Golden State Killer, a criminal who has had a decades-long crime spree, basically, responsible for over 12 murders, over 50 rapes, and many breakings and enterings, and other kind of crimes like that kind of almost go hand in hand with the murder and rape, honestly, in some interesting ways. The suspect was finally caught. It was a cold case. It was like a completely cold, dead case.
Yes.
And it was one that gained renewed attention thanks to the work of Michelle McNamara, who sadly passed away before this killer could be caught. But I think it's a good question to ask if he would have ever even have been caught had her book not sort of put the spotlight back on the case. But anyways, the killer was caught in a way. The killer was caught in a way that is ethically interesting. It is potentially questionable, and frankly, it is potentially the beginnings of the use of biological engineering and not necessarily biological engineering, but DNA science, DNA studies in a way outside of normal criminology that potentially suggests some huge ethical questions for us as a society and especially as scientists. So that's kind of what we're going to dive into on this episode of the Mad Scientist Podcast. And now the intro will play. Welcome to the Mad Scientist Podcast, Military Industrial Complex Part 2. So Marie, why don't you kind of give the background here on how did this all come about?
Well, like you said, there is a author, Michelle McNamara, and she wrote a blog. She had a very prominent true crime blog and was sort of this, she was a true crime aficionado and found this cold case for this killer that didn't really have the moniker of Golden State Killer, and began to research, interview people, and piece together sort of this huge legacy of the aftermath of this person's crimes, and was very intrigued by it, and again came up with the more popular name that people are calling him now, which is Golden State Killer. And began to write a book about it. And as you mentioned in our intro, she passed away before the book actually was published. So her husband, famous comedian Patton Oswalt, and her publishers put together her notes, changed it as very little as possible, and then published the book out. It's also its own podcast. I believe it is being developed for a television series. Her writing in the book and her efforts to sort of detangle this huge Gorgon's knot of all of this evidence and this huge sort of time frame that all of this was happening in the in the mid to late 70s to early 80s is really impressive writing, and it's very detailed and it's very graphic. But she's also, even in her notes, you can sense her drive to really understand what's going on and really get to the bottom of it and to solve this case. You can really feel that sort of drive in her authorship, and it's a really great book. I recommend it highly to anybody who is a true crime fan or that likes that type of stuff. It's a little graphic, so but going back and reading it now too, I think would be very interesting because it's now solved. But you bring up, Chris, a very interesting point, which I hadn't even really thought about too much, is would this have occurred had this not had this spotlight put on it?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think, I mean, I doubt that it would have. I'm happy it did, and I believe that this killer should have been brought to justice. You know, I'm happy it happened now, even though a lot of the crimes that he had committed are already, it's past, I don't want to say the expiration date, but whatever, what's the term? Of course, it's leaving my mind the minute I try and get to it, right?
It's the basically like the time that is allowed for a crime to be prosecuted. It's the statute of limitations.
It has already passed the statute of limitations. So a lot of that he cannot be tried for. However, for all of the murders, he can be tried for. But I am wondering if this, had he's now in his 70s, had he just gone to his grave without facing justice, if this hadn't have occurred. So in some ways, it's interesting that, the ends are, you're looking at sort of the ends of like, well, they caught him and they did this, and it's sort of, it does give this satisfying end to a story, but the question remains about, well, there's a lot of serial killers out there. Probably there's a lot of crime out there that don't get the same type of notoriety, that don't get the same type of attention.
Yeah.
That warrant it just as equally as anyone else. And then also how they caught this killer. To your point, the science behind it, the mass commercialization of your genetic material being utilized in a way that may or may not be something that you're even aware of it's happening, is questionable.
Yeah.
And is interesting.
So the case itself started in basically around 1974.
Mm-hmm.
And these are kind of the murders and rapes, right? It's likely with this killer, like in the case of other serial killers, we'll find that they probably had prior criminal records before that, or not criminal records, prior crimes that they committed beforehand that will be more kind of indicative of their ultimate paraphilia and psychology,
mm-hmm.
right? And so paraphilia, by the way, just in case anyone doesn't know, paraphilia is an abnormal, or not abnormal. It is a non-traditional fascination sexually with a particular thing, right, or object. So the most common paraphilia is foot fetishism. There's other ones as well. There's things like being literally.
Gotta run it down for you, folks.
Well, it's kind of like a necessary part of talking about serial killers,
mm-hmm.
right? There's also stuff, being fascinated with shoes, or there are other ones. There's a whole slew of them. Anything that you can
mm-hmm.
think of, there's probably at least one person in the world who gets their rocks off thinking about it or touching it or whatever. So anyways, the Golden State Killer was operating from 74 to 86 in the United States, particularly in California in the Sacramento area.
Mm-hmm.
And had a number of different names over the years. So he started as the Visalia Ransacker, became the East Area Rapist, then the original Night Stalker. He was also known as the Diamond Knot Killer for some time, and then, like Marie said, most recently as the Golden State Killer, which actually ties together a couple of other types of crimes as well. Now, they had DNA evidence from these crimes, even back in the 80s. But because they didn't have access to any suspects, they were not able to actually check against that for anything, right?
Right.
And at the time when they had the DNA, kind of the DNA databases that they use today for this stuff weren't available, right? So today, if you go to jail or you are found guilty of a crime that sends you to jail or prison, they'll take your DNA, right? They'll take your
Mm-hmm.
DNA for kind of tracking, and so
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of a way that they keep or are able to find a lot of criminals today. But back then, that wasn't available. That wasn't a thing that happened. Now,
No,
so
and
basically,
I would say even today within criminal justice system, it's becoming more. I think post 9/11, it's becoming more of a federal sort of nationwide
yeah,
database. But before, fingerprints, DNA would be highly siloed within states,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
So if you were arrested and you committed a crime, your DNA would be housed in some sort of a database in New York State or
yeah,
even in New York City, but it may not, you could go ahead and commit a crime in someplace like New Hampshire, and they may not have the connectivity to go and find your DNA in another state. So now it's it is still somewhat limited, but it's still somewhat segmented. And I think that uh, there's a lot of bureaucracy too with going across states and going
100%,
across,
yeah,
and trying to utilize and find this data. And as well, there should be. I mean, there's when you say bureaucracy, it's has a negative connotation, but it's also like these things are in place because you need rules when you're going about something like this. You can't just, you know, cherry pick someone's DNA or go after someone's information without sort of a process to it. So
yeah,
now, from everything I've been reading, it does seem like there's more um, cooperation in finding these things out and networking these things better. But the criminal justice system versus a commercially run aggregate of DNA, like something like that this was found in, are two entirely different things.
yeah.
They're entirely different structures.
So
Yes.
let's kind of okay. So obviously we're not a true crime podcast. That's not what you guys are listening here for. But we wanted to
Not
go.
yet.
But we wanted to go. Not yet. But we wanted to go through just a couple of things that kind of
Mhm.
made this case in particular difficult to solve. So first off,
Yes.
if you look at the sketches of the suspect that they had, they actually are all pretty common. Like they all look pretty similar, actually, which makes it interesting. Except for the one that makes him look like a bowling ball, with big eyes and a wide open mouth. But his modus operandi, though, was basically to tie up the victims. Um, force the female to tie up the male victim, kill the male victim, and then
Just gruesome.
basically continuously rape the female for some period of time. Usually the male was still alive while this happened, and usually this occurred over the course of hours. So he would stay in the house, he would eat, he would hang around and stuff, um, and then just kind of leave. Right. And that was kind of his whole thing. And so there was really no, it seemed like he was traveling on foot. There didn't seem to be any kind of car or anything involved, at least near the home. He, used open spaces, so it wasn't clear that he was walking along an open space. And so ultimately, what they ended up with were these sort of these large numbers of cases with kind of these sketches that look somewhat
Right.
similar. And then they came up with the following profile. So the known physical characteristics were a white male, approximately 5'10" tall, which is 1.78 meters for our European listeners, slender but athletic, size 9 to 9.5 shoes, type A blood. He was a non-secretor, which means that his blood, which means that basically his non-blood fluids, body fluids, did not contain antigens from his blood group. So like his saliva, his sperm in particular, did not have these secretions. And then it seemed like he was physically agile in some way because he was able to run, could scale fences, all this other stuff.
Right.
Then
the FBI also said, I don't know if you have this, but white male, close to 6 feet tall, athletic build, may have an interest or training in military and in law enforcement techniques.
Yeah, and so the other probable physical characteristics included things like he was probably 18 to 25 when the rapes began in 76, but probably would place him around 60 to 75 in 2018. He had blonde or brown hair, blue or light colored eyes, and had a penis size frequently described as small or smaller than average, both of which are in quotes on the Wikipedia page, which I find to be very respectful, which is good, I suppose. So here's the interesting thing, right? Basically, they're saying it was a white guy, right? It was a white guy with like brown or blonde hair, blue eyes, So you've narrowed it down to 20 million people, right?
Well, they did get military and
I'm talking about the physical description.
Yes.
Now but we do know from our previous episodes that these psychological profiles are often super duper wrong, right? So here was the psychological profile here. Was this is from Leslie D'Ambrosia, the primary author of the profile, and so they said that it was likely that they would have an emotional age equivalent to 26 or 30-year-old at the time of the murders, engaged in deviant paraphilic behavior and brutal sex in their personal life, sex with prostitutes, had some knowledge of police investigative methods and evidence gathering techniques, was sexually functional and capable of ejaculation, dressed well, would not stand out in upscale neighborhoods, lived or worked near Ventura, California in the 80s, good physical condition, skilled and experienced cat burglar, likely began that way, had a criminal record as a teenager that was expunged, had some means of income but did not work in the early morning hours, hated women for real or perceived wrongs, if married, had a submissive spouse who tolerated his sexually deviant behavior, was intelligent and articulate, likely began as a voyeur in his late teens or early 20s, was neat and well organized, drove a well-maintained car, peeped into windows before the attacks actually occurred, possibly unmarried and did not enter into long-term relationships, self-assured and confident, would continue committing violent crimes until incapacitated by prison, death, or some other intervention, and would have been described by those who knew him as arrogant, domineering, manipulative, and a chronic liar. Literally all of those things, not to take away from the work of Leslie D'Ambrosia, literally all of those things any one of us could have guessed. Right?
Yeah, I'm always curious with the car. I think that's relatively, like, he would have a very neat car, which I guess, like, almost is more common sense. Like, if you were committing these things, you wouldn't want, you would want as non-obtrusive or as
right, absolutely.
Like, you would just walk by a normal car, right?
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Be like, God, look at all the junk this dude has in the back of his car. It's like God, what is this?
Yeah, all of these things are like, they committed violent sexual crimes, so they probably were violent sexually even outside of the crimes. He probably had problems with sexual boundaries, so he probably had sex with prostitutes and was a voyeur. He hated women because all of his, shit, Sherlock, of course. Yeah. He had some means of income and did not work in them early. Like, that's all you came up with? Are you kidding me? My favorite here
What year was that, though? What year was that? They came up with that?
Oh, that's actually a good question.
Sounds like it could be early 70s or 80s, kind of when this was starting to formulate, right? I would hope that they'd be better now with just the sheer amount of data and statistics out there. But this was from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, Miami Regional Operations Center. This was written in. This was written towards the end of the crimes. So we're talking like the 90s. 90s.
Huh? We're talking like the crimes ended in 86. This was written in like. So it doesn't give an exact date here, but but this says, yeah, I would expect that this was occurring around early 90s, somewhere around there, or late 80s. That's probably the earliest that it could have been done. Now, here's the other thing. The part of this that I find really interesting is, if married, probably has a submissive spouse who tolerated his sexually deviant behavior, or possibly unmarried and did not enter into long-term relationships. It's kind of like, I think I've told this story before about my neighbor's kid who came by, and I was like, "Oh, is that a balloon?" And he was like, "Yeah, it is or it isn't." And I was like, "Yup, you are correct, little kid. That's fucking correct."
But
You know,
how much of this did they get right, though, in now going back and
so
looking at it?
far they got that he had some knowledge of police investigative methods and evidence gathering techniques, which that could also include, again, anyone who has ever listened to a true crime podcast, right? They probably got right deviant paraphilic behavior and brutal sex in his personal life. We don't know that yet, but I bet they probably did. And they got right.
Well, they know that he was married,
and they got right, but they also had the thing there where they said he probably wasn't married, or had problems with long-term relationships. Like, a lot of this stuff to me, again, it is like, you give a prediction, and then you go back and you look and see what, is it descriptive now of the thing that I see? Well, of course it is, right? But look,
he was a police officer, so they actually, but that was also commonly held with people investigating the crime at the time. That he not just that they had the suspicion that because of evidence that they found, right?
Yeah.
That he had not just a knowledge, but that I think that even predated that profile. But they thought that this guy could be in law enforcement in some respect.
Maybe. So the interesting thing is when this is straight from Wikipedia. I'm going to read the Wikipedia thing that they have here. Ready? Okay. Joseph D'Angelo.
Wikipedia.
Okay. Joseph D'Angelo was born in Bath, New York, the son of Joseph James D'Angelo Sr. and Kathleen Louise DeGroat. D'Angelo attended 9th grade at Mills Middle School in Rancho Cordova, California. He was in the U.S. Navy during the Vietnam War, serving as a damage controlman on the cruiser USS Canberra. After returning to the U.S., D'Angelo worked as a police officer in Exeter from 73 until 76, then in Auburn from 76 to 79, when he was fired after being caught shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent. From 1990 until his retirement in 2017, D'Angelo worked as a truck mechanic at the Roseville Distribution Center for Save Mart supermarkets. D'Angelo's work history in the decade between his Auburn and Roseville jobs is not currently known. D'Angelo was engaged to a woman named Bonnie in the 70s who he met as a classmate at Sierra College, but he never married her. This fact matched a statement that the offender made during one of his attacks, "I hate you, Bonnie." He married a lawyer in 73 and had 3 daughters with her. They broke up in 1991. D'Angelo was living in Citrus Heights with one of his daughters and a granddaughter at the time of his arrest. His brother-in-law, James Huddle, recalled D'Angelo casually bringing up the East Area rapist in conversation during the original case. Neighbors reported that D'Angelo frequently engaged in loud and profane outbursts. So this guy was living in the areas where all the crimes occurred. He was known to have, I feel like Bonnie is not a super common name, right?
Well, for the time, though, if you think about for the time,
sure,
it might have been, and the location, it might have been. I don't know.
He was a police officer who was fired for shoplifting seemingly cheap items. To me, those are all red flags. You know what I mean? Like, to me, like the shoplifting in particular is a red flag because it shows a desire to commit crimes. And of course, like a lot of people shoplift. A lot of people do that when they're kids. Whatever.
I shoplift all the time.
Okay.
I'm teasing.
Let's not get into this, Marie. Let's not add to your list of known and suspected crimes.
All the time. But I can't even go into Target anymore.
You know what I'm saying, though, right?
Where I'm at. No, totally. I think too, but they also say that when they interview the police officers that he worked with, that he was seemingly overeducated for the small department that he worked in. Like he had a way of talking or a way of sounding that he had, but he knew a lot, right?
Sure.
And so that he had this sort of, he may have just had a bachelor's degree, but he had like all sorts of other different types of training. But there was also something about him that, quote unquote, just did not fit in with the other police officers.
Well, yeah, of course. And the other thing too is the suspects that they actually eliminated include Brett Glasby, who is a suspect until he was murdered in Mexico. In 82,
that'll take care of that.
Right? Paul Cornfed Schneider was a high-ranking member of the Aryan Brotherhood prison gang. And Joe Alsip, who was tested for DNA and cleared. Now, to me, what's interesting is testing this Aryan Brotherhood guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
To me suggests a complete misunderstanding of what this. I mean, if there is one thing that the profile gives us, it's the idea that he's intelligent and well organized and capable of knowing about police investigative processes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, of course, like having terrible opinions and being a member of a violent gang doesn't mean you're not intelligent, right? But I would think that a guy that was a ranking member in the Aryan Brotherhood, I got a feeling that guy's gonna stick out at a Walmart, so it's
Yeah.
kind of like, don't know if it was him, you guys.
He might have
Anyways,
something messy on his car. Like he'll have something that you remember, right? Like the thing that I think is
a thing of
interesting.
Calvin peeing on a Star of David or something horrendous,
I think
something fucking stupid as hell.
that's the thing that is interesting about Angelo, though, is that he is remembered as being serious and intelligent. And maybe now it's more of sort of that lens, you're looking at him and he's like, well, it's quite strange one. He was always struck me as a little strange, right? But I will say, like, they did get the two big things that were in the profile, that were in the police investigation: time in the military, and had strong working knowledge of law enforcement.
Yeah, but
But I mean, I don't, like,
one
I don't
out of
know.
like 15. Or 2 out of 15. That's not super great, right?
It's not. Yeah, but I don't know. I also that I have not seen or read, and I'm not. I think profiling to me it's interesting, but it's also been so
heartily shown to be full of butt. That it has no value.
I was going to say it's been so fictionalized that to me it's not interesting anymore. It's like,
sure.
As soon as I can watch Hannibal on Netflix, right? Like I'm sort of like, this is great, but now it's completely fictionalized, and it's like, I don't know. It's like the exceptionalism of serial killing and serial killers, I think, is also maybe done in some ways. Like, that's not as interesting. And I think in seeing something like this, you're also seeing sort of the mundaneness of who this person was in a 100%, lot of ways.
And how easy it is to catch someone because their relative really wanted to see just how much % Irish they were. So let's get into this. So
not that easy, because clearly, I mean, and you have to give it up for, like, had they had that technology at the time, there would have been something else to it, right? They could have caught him they would have caught him sooner had they had this this huge database to draw from. I don't know. It's a chicken and the egg. Okay, but let's get into that. That's a good point.
All right. So what they found was that basically by testing the DNA of this case against the DNA inside of one of the large databases of DNA. Now, this is interesting. I didn't know this until recently. The website that they went to is GED Match.
Yes.
Okay. Which has over 1 million or nearly 1 million users and is used often to resolve family mysteries and adoption cases. Okay. Ooh. So it's already questionable, right? Because in my mind, family mysteries is one thing, right?
Well, family mysteries in my family is like, who ate the leftover ribs.
So
like that's a family mystery.
No. See. So we have family mysteries that would be solved by something like this potentially, right? So my grandma, we don't know what her family was like in Yugoslavia before World War II. We don't know anything about them, right? We don't even know if we still have relatives there or not. And but it was a part of her life that she desperately didn't want to talk about, right?
Right.
And I assumed because it wasn't a good time for her life, right? I mean, It seems like something that if you desperately didn't want to talk about, you wouldn't talk about it then, right? And at the same time, the idea of even adoptions of I can understand being the child of adoption and wanting to know desperately who your parents are. But I can also understand being that parent and not wanting them to know. Do you know what I mean?
Agree.
It's a very sticky, it's a very challenging situation, I think. And it sucks. And I feel for the child, for this person who's grown up not knowing their family and stuff. You know what I mean? You didn't ask for that to happen to you. Right. So that's terrible.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I can also understand this person doing this under the assumption that this is a way for me to kind of, um, I don't know, be free of this or something, right? As terrible as
Well,
it is.
you have a
Um,
right to privacy. I mean, that's the thing upon doing this is you're guaranteed, like in certain, for closed adoptions, it is closed because of the wishes of the person who's putting the child for adoption. And, good, bad, or indifferent, that's, how you emotionally feel about it, that's in place again for a reason. It is, to your point, it's awful in some ways, but it exists for a reason. And to create something like this, opens a really big can of worms, like a DNA match to go into some sort of huge profile and be able to find this out. For a family mystery or for adoptions. I don't know. It's sort of it it it's this inevitability of this much data being out there and being utilized, but
yeah.
it's also questionable. It's like the intent of what you enter into this contract legally and by law
Mm-hmm.
is closed. I will not contact the child. The child will not know anything about me. They will grow up with family, right? And that's what's important. They will grow up with a family that wants them. And maybe, again, I don't not knowing too much about it. If there's, you know, if it's a closed adoption, it's that way for the entire
Mm-hmm.
time that they've had that. Does that
Yeah.
make
And
sense? Sorry, you know
you
what
know,
I
of
mean. It's
course.
like,
And then
yeah.
again, I think there is the need though for people to be able to know their like genetic history in the sense of say, you might be at a
Mm-hmm.
higher risk for cancers or diabetes or something like that, right? Like that all is also important stuff for you to know.
Yes.
It like this raises a lot of ethical questions. So with the Golden State Killer, what happened was this website, GED Match, you can
Mm-hmm.
actually upload your DNA to it, and then you can then check other people's that have been uploaded. Okay,
Yes.
so they
So you can
upload.
create
So
your own match, right? You
yeah,
can
so
create a profile.
yeah, so what they do is you upload your DNA sample, right? You get this raw data file, you upload it in, and then you get you can then match that information to other profiles on the site. Okay. Now
Mm-hmm.
this is a statement from and so because there's a million users on there, you can then use the database to get a sense of who this DNA might be connected to in some way. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So they actually didn't even need it doesn't even sound like they needed a warrant, right? So that's troubling. But so this is a statement from GED Match. This is from April 27th.
Mm-hmm.
The statement, quote, "We understand that the GED Match database was used to help identify the Golden State Killer. Although we were not approached by law enforcement or anyone else about this case or about the DNA, it has always been GED Match's policy to inform users that the database could be used for other uses as set forth in the site policy. While the database was created for genealogical research, it is important that GED Match participants understand the possible uses of their DNA, including identification of relatives that have committed crimes or were victims of crimes." The statement added, quote, "If you are concerned about non-genealogical uses of your DNA, you should not upload your DNA to the database and/or you should remove DNA that has already been uploaded. To delete your registration, contact gedmatch@gmail.com," end quote. Now, that it is insane to me. It is
Mm-hmm.
insane to me that people like there's that joke that goes around online, right? That's like, um 10 years ago, people were like, I don't want the government, I don't want the government knowing, whatever, like what websites I'm on and stuff. And now today we're like, hey, Google, does this picture of my butt make it look fat? Like
Totally.
it's ridiculous. Like I just said, okay, we have a Google Home. I just said, hey, Google in here in this soundproof room, and it fucking beeped.
Of course it did.
It's listening
to you all the time. There's I can't even believe you have one of those Google things, man.
Oh my God. The horrendous.
You want to talk about intrusive. You don't think that thing is recording you 24/7 and just being like, oh, they ordered a pizza. Oh, look, they're going out to Target. It is tracking you and it's tracking all of your behaviors to sell.
Well, of course.
Oh, Google. Oh, Google.
So the reason we have it is because you can tell it to turn the lights on in bed.
Oh, that's nice. So you don't even have to get up. It's like, but you could have a clapper for that, just like old school, like clap on, clap off. Don't you remember this? You got to Google that.
I do hear that. I do understand that.
Ask your Google to Google that. That's too funny. But okay, so back to GED, DNA match, whatever it's called. So you go in. So I'm a federal investigator. I'm someone from law enforcement. I can create a fake profile using the DNA that I have found at a crime site.
Yes.
I've uploaded it, and then I can basically screen through just records and records and records of data to narrow it to, it wasn't a one-to-one match necessarily. So we should be clear about that. It's like, it basically narrowed it down to different familial groups of people. And then they had to go back into that and eliminate people or find people that fit the profile better.
Yes.
So if there wasn't a male, if the male was too young, too old, dead, whatever, that's how they narrowed it down to this one particular guy. But they could not have done that had it not been sort of for this open platform for data,
yes, exactly.
for your gene. And I think there's something really insidious about like, everybody has this innate want to know where they came from, just like you were saying, like with adoption or just in general, like where did I come from? What is my makeup? What made me what I am? And you can now just swab the inside of your cheek, send it in, and they're going to give you this entire like hypothetical. I haven't done it, but this skew of saying, hey, it's like your X amount this, your Y amount this. I mean, that is inherently plugging into, something that is amazing and something that is like you want to know. That's part of, I think, what makes people human is they want to know that. And that's what's so insidious is that in doing that, you are basically giving up your rights to that little tiny piece of you that is still 100% you. So that little tiny piece of 100% Marie Mayhew could be out there and could be profiled in all sorts of different ways. Could be used for all sorts of different things.
Well, yeah, and then once it's online too, it's pretty much impossible to remove. I mean, you can remove it, right? You can ask to be removed from the database, but like, how effective is that really going to be? Right?
Anything that has occurred up to that point is still out there, and you don't know. I have not read I think it would be interesting, and something I'm going to do is go back and I want to read sort of what their disclaimer is. Can they sell that? Can they sell their profiles? Can they say, well, we've created sort of within this million of people, we've come up with sort of different buckets of types of people that we know are from this area and have this type of background and have the genetic makeup of this. Because of all the information you're voluntarily giving them, they're starting to be able to get a better picture of who you are. If they can get a picture of who you are, they can sell it and say, so I'm going to give all of this genetic makeup to another group who wants to buy it.
Yeah, it's a very troubling idea.
So troubling. And the more you think of it, the less I would love to hear from listeners or for somebody who has a more, I don't want to say positive viewpoint of this, but has a more benign take on on that this is not an invasion of your civil liberties, because like we've said, it is wonderful and it is justice that this man was caught before he died and will face sentencing and will face justice. And it should have happened long ago. The methods in which this occurred is problematic, to say the least, though, in any ways that I can parse it out.
It is a huge challenge. I mean, so the problem, I think one of the most interesting things about this is the ability of them to basically, so the fact that they weren't, you don't even need to have an exact match, right? You can just have it be a relative. So you yourself, I mean, of course, like this person committed a crime, right? But the idea that that even if you are just so here's kind of the scenario I'm thinking that might be interesting is, let's say you're great, let's say someone in one of your family trees, so someone in one of the branches of your family trees, right, is wanted for a horrible crime, right?
Yes.
Let's say that's true. Let's say though that you have been shoplifting, right? Or you have been,
as you do at Target on a Sunday.
I don't know, something stupid, right? Something even less criminally, whatever, less criminal than shoplifting. Let's say you have been, I don't know, illegally stealing cable or something, right? You've been stealing cable from your neighbor for years. All right. The police narrow down the pool of suspects to someone in your family tree. So they start surveilling everyone in your family to see which of you guys is the most likely. And let's say even that they do it a little bit higher level than that. Let's say that they get to the point where they are thinking, okay, well, there are, there's 7 of these guys in this family. They match the type of people, whatever. And you happen to be one of those 7. And the cops in their surveilling of you find out that you've been stealing cable, so they write you a ticket, or they use that to bring you into the station to talk to you, right? And it just snowballs, it spirals, right? Any time you get kind of potentially in trouble with the police, you have to be very careful, right? I mean, I know a lot of people that are very good that are police, but you should still just, you should protect yourself and be careful in those situations, right?
Great.
So to me, it's interesting that this could be used to nab, like, what happens then? Let's say they bring you up on charges of that. Let's say they use it. Let's say in their attempt to get into your house to get to talk to you, you resist arrest. Or let's say, you have weed in your apartment, or you have, whatever, right? And these charges keep stacking and stuff. And then it turns out you're not even the one that's wanted for this bigger crime. They just caught you in the net because they used this questionable method, right? What happens to that case? What?
Yeah.
Where does that go?
No, I hear you, and I think that's the big problem with it. It's like there's no oversight on legally how this should be used. And also you brought up a good point, like, so how with law enforcement, the intent is, and we can debate whether this happens all the time or not, which is a different subject entirely, but the intent is when you get a sample DNA, it is treated in a certain way and it is preserved in a certain way, right? It is not tampered with. It is kept safe, and it is not going to be corroded or manipulated or anything else, right? When I send in, I'm doing a swab and I'm sending it in, the chain of command between me and my sample of what actually happened is open. It's not a closed chain of command. There's a million different places that something could happen to it.
Sure.
So it's not even 100% close match, or or I don't want to say it's not 100% close match, because clearly it is, but it's not a a safe environment in which to be making sort of this life and death, or prosecutable decisions in a
Yeah,
lot of ways.
it
There's
well
a
it
lot of places it could go.
there's a yeah,
awry.
there's a lot of wiggle room, right?
Yes.
There's a lot of really weird things that can happen there. And then I think even more troubling potentially is, so yeah, it could all go wrong, right? All of this
Yes.
stuff can go wrong. And again, this to me seems like a very, once they did it, it was done, right?
Right.
It's not like then you can go back and say, well, actually he matches all these other pieces of evidence, right? You've already narrowed him down using this questionable technique. And the thing is too, this isn't the first time that this kind of family member genealogy has been used, but it's the only time that it's been, or it is, I think, one of the first major cases where it's been gotten from this kind of open forum almost.
Open sourced.
Right?
Open
Yeah.
sourced.
People are so, I'm sorry, if you are uploading your DNA onto the website, onto the internet, you are dumb. I mean, that's true. So there were people.
Lord.
So the Grim Sleeper case was famously solved this way, right? But they got that partial match from someone in the prison system, right? The killer's son was in the prison system, and so they got the match of the DNA. They thought originally, well, maybe it's the son, and then they realized, no, it's actually the father, right?
Yeah.
There are other ones like that too, right? The Canal Killer, which was in Phoenix, Arizona, basically they sent the information to a genealogist, and the genealogist emailed the police the suspect's last name. Right? So yeah, it's, and the way that occurred was the genealogist actually ran the DNA on Family Tree DNA and Ancestry.com. Which then let them get up to the point where they were able to say this is the killer, right?
But I mean, a good lawyer, like a lawyer, is going to be able to take that stuff. Like a defense lawyer can take that stuff apart.
Well, see, but this is the where kind of I think the science and its effects on, say, the least, what's the word? The least rich, right?
Yeah.
Those just will simply not, like, if you're rich enough, you can get a lawyer to throw that out. But if you're poor, right, and you don't have the what's the word? You don't have the, I don't know, the money for a lawyer, then that is going to happen regardless of the fact that it's totally against. It can in theory be said to go completely against your civil
defense.
Liberties. Right.
A court appointed attorney. You have a court appointed attorney that may or may not have a workload that is almost overwhelming to begin with, then you're only going to get X amount of time to put towards against disproving the science versus someone that you are paying to do. And if you have a certain amount of affluence, then you naturally are going to be able to afford a better prosecution.
Absolutely.
Or a better defense. Sorry. Oh man, dude, I was a little like, people that upload, they're not stupid, but it's not that I'm almost tempted to agree with you, but in the same regard, I also feel like, you don't, I remember when it first started coming out, I was like, that doesn't seem like a good idea, right? That doesn't seem like, one, I bet it's not that accurate, and two, I bet it's not that great of idea, but they've got they're putting money behind the marketing of it. And we can talk a little bit about the companies that are doing this. I mean, basically, it's to be able to kind of formulate and have these huge databases of DNA. I think as a commercial enterprise are suspect to begin with, because as a money-making venture, you're looking at that, and to me, it's like, okay, well, you're going to take advantage of people wanting to know what their history is anyways, which is, again, a natural human condition. You want to know those things. So it's an easily marketable thing. But I think, to me, it is just amazing. And again, I don't want to I don't want to incite people to start hollering about big government or nanny state, but that there's no oversight. There's no government regulatory agency that says, yeah, this is okay for entertainment or commercial, entertainment value only. These are the only things that they should be able to legally find out about you as a person. The rest of this, they should be throwing it away, or they should only be able to keep, what the data or what your genetic makeup tells you about this certain bit of your life, but everything else should be expunged. Just like HIPAA, right? Just like if you go into a hospital and you've broken your ankle, those records are yours. They're sealed. They're not to be sold. They can't be viewed. You are the only one that has your medical file. And that's because your medical file is closely tied to your identity, to your DNA, and to who you are. And so it is inherently something that you are not, that, you can't that it's not supposed to be sold or commoditized to a certain extent.
Right. It becomes a much larger, I think. I mean, of course, it becomes a much larger issue as soon as money is involved, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of where the ethical questions come about for these like medical records and stuff. Although that even is starting to be, starting to be changed in some ways,
which is so incredibly scary. I can't begin to start talking about that.
So okay, so how does this all go then with the? How does this all come into the military-industrial complex, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this was
tying it back, people. We're tying it back.
So this was DNA obviously has a lot of benefits, right? It has a lot of really good things. The analysis of DNA, I mean, I'm talking about DNA has a lot of benefits. Like, it's the fucking backbone of life, right? But DNA analysis and even genealogy.
Like everybody should have some DNA. It's really good for you. In fact, you should have more than one DNA. You should have like a bunch.
Now sold on the Mad Scientist website. DNA infused water. Come get it.
DNA infused water. You should have some.
We just spit into a bottle of water. So whose spit is it though? So
God. So patent pending, copyright.
So we have this idea of DNA analysis and genealogy and its use in things like, bioengineering, and even the sense of, say, so one concept in bioengineering today is the option or the idea to actually create what are basically clones of you. But not like a big clone, not like a human-sized clone, right? We're talking about a genetic clone of you that is basically like cells in a petri dish, right?
Oh my God.
And then those cells can then be studied for the effect of, say, okay, let's say, God forbid, you get cancer, right? Well, there are a lot of cancer drugs that can only be used for people with certain genetic phenotypes, right? And so we need to know, okay, can this cancer drug be used on you as an individual? Well, besides, let's say instead of them actually having to test it on you, right? They can just run this test to see, will it work on your DNA? Will it work on cells, cancer cells with your DNA, right? Or even bigger questions than that, even, are your cells more likely to become metastatic, right? If you have cancer, or are there ways for you to, are there specific ways that a disease will progress in you that maybe it would not occur in something else, right? These are all kind of long-term goals of this stuff, but the idea is that eventually your DNA will become not only a interesting kind of tool for you to give away for free on the internet, but will become a important diagnostic and medical tool, right?
Right.
And it kind of gets into this, it's interesting. One of the big conspiracy theories that was out there, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, was that your DNA in some way would get linked to, say, a credit card or a number or something. And that was supposed to be the number of the beast, right? Turns out, literally, all people had to do was figure out a way to turn it into something, your mom is interested in Googling, and all of a sudden, everyone's DNA is on the internet, for free. They didn't have to pay you for your DNA. They just gave you
paid them.
Yeah,
paid them.
You paid them for answers you probably kind of already knew, right? And again though, this is I think this is what I think is very insidious and very very, very questionable, let's say. If there is one, I think, area or one group of people, let's say, who would, I think, be particularly interested in finding this kind of information out about their genealogy, I would think that if I was someone whose family history has been erased by, let's say, a transatlantic slave trade, right? I would be very interested. I would be very interested in finding that out about, well, what country did my, where are my roots? Where is my family really from? Right? I think that would be an interesting thing for people to look for. And these sites that do it for free are wide open now to police scrutiny. Right?
Yeah.
But the ones that cost money, a lot of money in some cases, for you to send your stuff to are the ones that are being protected.
Yes.
So it's kind of it's sort of a very,
fucked.
It's
Call
a very,
it what it is, man. That is affluence. That's like privilege.
It is complete privilege, right? And it's a very interesting, I think, part of this whole story that I think will eventually become more important is if this tool is going to be used against any community, it'll probably be communities of color, right? And communities that are communities of people that are generally already, viewed by some to be more kind of, already being racially profiled, right? In some ways.
Yeah. Well, and I think that even can be, applied to sort of the hunt for this killer to begin with in some ways. And the want to solve it is that the victims were in a relatively affluent part of
this doesn't happen here. Right. This doesn't happen in our community.
It was pretty affluent, and if you look at like serial killers that focus on women of color that are sex workers, that doesn't get the same sort of necessarily the same sort of attention or the same sort of drive that maybe something like this story does. Now that should not take away from the horror that
of
this
the crime
story, the crime
of course
itself,
not.
Right? Or that the victims of these crimes deserve closure, and they deserve to have justice served. As such does anyone that is a victim of crime. As such does all communities that make up our country. And I feel like you see these things and you start to, as soon as you start to dig into them a little bit more, you start to see sort of the inequality in it and the sort of this inherent bias that's coming up. Like, to your point, which is really excellently thought out, it is about privilege. Like, this is if you can't afford it, you're putting these things into it. This is what's being mined, and you can be sure of it. Something else that that you have to pay for has tighter reins around it.
And see, and this is actually
insidious again.
Totally. And this is actually one area I think though where, so for instance, in the case of the Grim Sleeper crime, right? A tool like this, I mean, it's actually very interesting. This is kind of an interesting dichotomy where the Grim Sleeper is kind of the perfect example of kind of the less dead not getting the kind of attention that they deserve, right? He was able to go for so long, people in the neighborhood supposedly knew who this was. All the sex workers knew, this guy, stay away from this guy, right?
Yeah.
But
did that warrant police?
Well, what I'm saying though is that it's interesting that both of these cases were solved by kind of similar stuff here. But in the case of the Grim Sleeper, it occurred because of kind of kind of a lucky break, right? Whereas in this case, it happened because, I guess, again, I don't know if I call it lucky break, almost a interesting use of new science that I think is definitely going to end up in the courts for some time. So, okay, so I think the ultimate questions now with this technology or this idea is, this is an idea that even, George Orwell could not have predicted, right? This is one of those areas where, there's an interesting argument that goes that when we talk about it a lot on the show, where if a system that's in power wants to stay in power, what it can do, or what it tends to do sometimes, it appears, is to kind of co-opt and almost take in rebellion or ideas against the system itself, and then spit them back out in a way that seems like it's still the same, but really now is actually reinforcing the system, right?
Right.
And so and so of course, as I've mentioned many times in the show, the perfect example of that, in my opinion, is punk rock culture being eaten up and shit at by Hot Topic, right? Now,
and then I naturally have to come to Hot Topic
defense, right? Because Marie is a sellout. So I'm just playing. I'm just kidding.
Sir,
I'm just kidding.
I take umbrage. No, I'm teasing. Yeah,
I can feel the hard edge from here. But
I still shoplift at Target. No, I'm teasing.
So
do I? I don't.
Okay,
yes,
good.
I do.
I know you don't. You don't, Marie. Stop it.
I don't.
So
that's just a persona I'm playing. I totally shop at Target.
You're gonna get kicked at a Target. You don't want that.
No.
You definitely don't want that. I think what's interesting here is, so with this kind of stuff, where in some ways DNA analysis, DNA forensics, this kind of stuff is a very valuable tool, because it allows police to be certain that a criminal is the perpetrator of a crime, right? That the suspect, I shouldn't say the criminal, the suspect is a match for the crime if DNA evidence is available, right? And so I think the promise of DNA forensics was, this is going to let us get the criminal every time, right?
Yes.
We are not going to have the kind of horrible, mistrials of justice that occur where, just kind of normal police work, which is fraught with peril and fraught with
human error.
Human error and challenges,
human error.
right? And even if you are the best cop, even if you are the best person for the job, the kind of cop that 100% should do the job, it's still possible for you to make errors, right? It's still possible for something to happen that will get it wrong, right? And so this tool will allow us to completely remove that as an option. Well, we've kind of gotten to the point, though, now with these genealogy websites, where if we don't protect our own information, such as DNA stuff, and it's not even your own information. This is someone in your family putting it up on the website. A cousin you've never met in a state you've never been to, or a country you've never been to, can put this stuff online, and now they can track you, right? I actually wonder. This is a second point I'm going to make afterwards.
Future generations.
Absolutely.
It's like,
absolutely. It becomes a question of, how much information, how much protection against these sorts of, we're trying to protect in some ways against an overreach of government, right? This tool is useful because it is useful for getting criminals for crimes that are cold cases, right? But it's also, I think, in some ways, even more beneficial for being certain that someone was at the scene of a crime, right? I would think that that's kind of a good way to sell this technology as a benefit. But at the same time, now it's almost going the wrong way. The benefit is turning sour, where, well, now we can know who did the crime, even if we have no real way of placing them there besides the DNA, right?
Agreed.
And that
Agreed.
leads open another question of things like, I think one of the most
due
famous
process.
well, one of the besides due process, in terms of the science itself, one of the most famous kind of cases of, questionable, I don't know if questionable verdict's the right word, but one of the biggest cases where people are questioning the results of an investigation is Adnan Syed, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And this wonderful podcast Serial. Well, the victim in that case was found in the woods, right?
Mm-hmm.
How much discarded DNA might there be in that area? You're running on the trail a half hour before, and they get your DNA there.
Mm-hmm.
This I think this suggests a long process of DNA becoming the only requisite evidence, right?
What I think, yeah, I think what's interesting too is like you assume that DNA is accurate, but DNA matches doesn't take human error out of it. It helps, just like fingerprints, right? It has a higher degree of certainty, but it's not 100% definitive. Just
No,
because, again, in any stretch of the imagination and in actuality, it's being handled and manipulated by people, and their errors will occur. So it's like that's sort of a myth in itself that the DNA is a perfect 100% thing. But now you take DNA, to your point, take DNA and you put it in this huge aggregate without any sort of chain of evidence way of keeping any of this stuff safe, without any kind of process or without any kind of intent that it should be used to match to criminals or to criminal intent or anything like that. And it's just sort of almost a hodgepodge. Like there is no process behind it
Yeah.
anymore. And to your point, like too, it takes out context. It takes out where was this found? Like if DNA is found someplace, then at least you have a starting point and you have something that can back into other points that would lead toward an indictment. But this is a standalone. To your point, this is almost a standalone thing.
Yeah,
which is scary.
And it's letting them then build their case, whereas before, so they would have had this stuff beforehand, right? But
Yes.
it allows them though to build a case now on all this other circumstantial evidence that before maybe looked like there's not enough there, right? I mean this
Right.
just look at the way that even the two of us picking apart that criminal profile, right? We were able to find stuff to describe the situation versus prescribe it, right? We wouldn't have been able to get a suspect from that
No.
from that profile, but now with DNA there and a name and a face and a history, we can start building the pieces up. The other question, the other thing I think that's going to be fascinating is, I was actually talking about this the other day with someone about the ancient aliens thing. Actually, I was talking to
ancient aliens.
I was talking to the great folks over at the End of the Portal podcast, part of Damage Chippy Productions,
Yes.
where we talked about how, in some ways, technology, when you start to rely too strongly on a tool, you start to forget how to actually do the work that made the tool useful in the first place, or that the tool took over for, right? So it's kind of like, if you looked at a person in the 1800s versus someone today, and you put both of them on a desert island, the person from the 1800s would probably fare a lot better because they literally know how to do more stuff with less technology, right? They might still be able to start a fire on their own, and they might still be able to, get some, clean themselves even in the river. Like they have some sense of how to do that stuff versus us today where, my cell phone dies at work and I might, I've gotten lost.
Forget functioning, man.
It's terrible.
What would I do without a Target? What am I
Exactly.
supposed to do? Where am I supposed to buy stuff?
Where are you supposed to shoplift?
It's crazy.
It's nuts. So when I think of with this stuff is, let's say we start relying on DNA more and more heavily, right? Well, what happens when the first lab is able to generate, is able to actually build DNA from scratch, right? and we're not even talking about building creating life, a cell or something, whatever. I'm literally just talking about the chemical structure of DNA, right? We're getting better and better at creating these self-aggregating molecules that build in these larger superstructures, right? Carbon nanotubes and things like that, and buckyballs and whatever, where it's the chemistry itself that causes them in solution to grow and build in a certain structure. Well, how long is it before our ability to manipulate DNA allows us to do the same thing? Or even like we do with genetic engineering, piece together DNA strands to create an aggregate that appears identical to real DNA, right?
Right.
When that happens, all of this forensics stuff goes out the window, right? When that happens, it loses its validity again. So I am interested to see how this gets handled by the courts, but I also wonder, this is one of those instances where, same with the march from, Marie Curie discovering that these materials degraded into these radioactive these components, right? That they degraded and released energy and heat. Going from that to, well, actually, if we put them in a certain way, we can create a tremendous amount of energy. To then, okay, well, let's stick it in a bomb. Like that march, it's hard to predict. And and who knows? I could be completely off base. That's the problem with predictions, is they're always wrong until they're right. So who knows?
And then they were right all along.
Right. And then
you're going to ride that horse until it drops dead.
And then even if you're wrong, sometimes you can still be thought that you were right, like Nostradamus.
Exactly.
The challenge, I think, an interesting question, I think, is our reliance on this tool too much, right? Will real kind of police work, real detective work ever kind of fall away, right? Because detective work in some ways is supposed to be based on, in some ways, in all ways, is supposed to be based on basically the same deductive process that science is based off of, right? So I think it's very, very interesting that we're using this tool today, but I am very, very I'm very interested to see how this case goes. I could totally see this case getting thrown out because you know what I mean? Like,
awful.
Which would be awful, but I could 100% see it getting thrown out because they're going to say, well, we could talk about this for hours. Right?
True. But I would also be interested in hearing from any of our viewers that have an alternate point of view. Because I feel like I just, like you, I look at this and it's so fraught with things that don't make sense, that I would love to hear the flip side of the debate. So, to your listeners, if you have one, holla and let us know, because we want to hear it.
Even from a pragmatic point of view,
Agreed.
Where I just see this getting eviscerated in a courtroom. You know what I mean?
And I hope not. Like, I think that the fundamental of police work, to your point, is
solid.
It's solid. Like, you are using a scientific method, you are using observation and deduction to put together a case piece by piece that's unassailable. And that the tools that you have and the ingredients that you put into that may change over time, but that formula is, in my mind, kind of what is the basis for investigation, right? That's that you are litmus testing, and you are finding out the facts, and you're putting the things together, and you're stress testing it continuously until you have reached an end goal that is not influenced by bias or by your own opinion. It's by the evidence that you've found and the facts. And I don't think that will ever change in quality and good police work. I hope that this case does come to justice. I would hope that it comes to justice just so people can have their closure in this entire thing. And I hope that there's I don't know. But to your point, man, it is the Pandora's box with this.
It sure is. I'm interested. I can't wait to kind of I
Mm-hmm.
can't wait to see, I guess, what ultimately comes from this.
Yes.
I actually think one of the other challenges with this, or one of the other issues, is the erosion of, like you said, civil liberties, in the sense that if a cop comes to you and says, "We have your DNA at the scene," I don't care how good your lawyer is. You are going to go home and think about, if you have a lawyer, you're maybe going to go home. If not, you're going to
Mm-hmm.
sit in a cell and think about, they have my DNA. I better just confess. I better
I bet.
just plead
Yes.
guilty, right? And so I think in that sense, it is also, again, again, what happens if the son pleads guilty, but it's actually the father's DNA, right? What if it's, right? Like, this
Agreed.
seems, again, like super fraught with problems. But yeah, listeners, if you have another point, if you have a differing viewpoint, we'd love to hear from you. Send us an email, the mad
Yes.
scientist podcast gmail.com. You can also reach us at mad scientist pod on Twitter, or at Team Giant Squid. And, that's
Yes.
it for this week. We'll be back next week with more military industrial complex. Next week, we
Mm-mm-mm.
are talking about the privatization of the military with groups like Blackwater and,
Good
yeah,
stuff.
very
It's
good stuff.
meaty good stuff.
Very interesting. And thank you again for listening. We'll be back next week.